In this second video of our beginner's course for Amazon Sumerian, we're going to look at how to add entities, how to transform those entities or change the transform values, and also how to nest or group entities. So let's get started. So I'm here in my scene. This is the same scene that I built in the last video, which is really just a empty scene, or not empty scene, it's a template using the default lighting scene template. So we have a few lights and a sky sphere, but for the most part it is empty. All right, so for this course what we're going to do, remember, is we're going to be building a training simulator. And if you remember the intro video that we showed, or if you experiment with the scene itself, there's a table involved that the spheres, the game balls drop down onto, and there's that table that is tilted and it continues to tilt. So that's one of the first things we're going to start with, is by creating that table. And we're going to use an empty entity that we're also going to use to nest that box in. And it all makes sense when we do it, and we'll explain in due time. However, let's just mess around a little bit with adding some entities and changing the transforms and the various ways to mess with those transforms. So let's create an entity, clicking the Create Entity button above the canvas. And let's just click Cone. So we get a cone over here, and I'm going to select it and frame it in my canvas with the F button, or I can click the Frame Selection button up here. There's my cone, nice and center in the middle of my canvas. We'll zoom out a little bit. So remember, every entity you have in your scene is going to have a transform component. That's because it's going to have some sort of position in your scene. And this one right now, everything will always come in at the 0, 0, 0 translation values, or the origin of our scene, the very center of our scene. And that's where our cone is. So there's a few different ways we can move this cone around or change the transform values. Now remember, there are three different types of transform. There is translation, rotation, and scale. Scale, of course, is how big it is. Rotation is how it is rotated around the three different axes. And the translation is also known as position. Where is it in the scene? So let's mess with those values first. So let's just change the X value to 1 and see what happens. It jumps over there. And then if I change the Y value to 1, it'll move up 1 unit. And if I change the Z value, it'll slide over to the right by 1 unit. So that's one way you can do it, is by entering exact values. And we will be doing both. We'll be using these various methods in this course. If I want to rotate it, let's try another method. I can also scrub, what's called scrubbing, to change these values. And that is, if I click inside the value box itself, click and hold, and I move it up or down, I can rotate that entity around that axis. So I can do the X, I can do the Y, and then also the Z, which is just currently, I can't really see it, spinning it. So that is the first two methods, is that you can enter in the value or enter in manually using your keyboard, or you can click drag, and that is scrub the values. And you can do the same with the uniforms or the scale. So I'm increasing the size of this cone dramatically along the X-axis, or the Y, so changing the shape of it. Now, we have a very oddly shaped cone at this point. Let's look at the other method. That is using the handles that are actually attached to the entity within the canvas. So right now, because I have the translation handles selected, you see these arrows. Well, if I select them and move them, I can drag the entity to where I want it to go visually. So now I'm changing the translation values. I can also change the rotation. So if I click the rotate button, I'll get rotate handles, or these rings. And so when I click one of these rings and rotate it by moving up or down, I am now rotating it, rotating the entity. The best way to do it, of course, is up or down. And or left or right. So that is how to use the rotation handles. And also, if I click the scale, you get these kind of look like box handles. So if I click on that, I can drag it out. And so this kind of allows me, it really does the same thing as scrubbing. And notice that as I'm doing this, the values change in real time over here in the transform component. So that is how you would change the transform values. Again, we will use different methods throughout this course, and a lot of times it'll depend on what you're trying to do. Does it need to be exactly lined up, or is having it just being visual good enough? So there's no one best way to do it. It just depends on your needs. I'm going to go ahead and delete this cone because I don't need it. I'll have cone selected, and then I'll click the trash can up here. This will delete my cone from my scene, and there it goes. All right. However, we do need to add a box, and a box is going to be a box will be the table that is going to be in our scene, and we're going to start with that table that you may remember from the training simulator scene. So let's add a box. Let's click Create Entity up here above the canvas. I will select Box. And we will get a box here in the middle. I don't want I rarely use the scale handles, so I'm not going to use that. I'm going to just go ahead and by default keep the translation handles selected. And I'll select it and then hit the F button to frame this box in the middle of our scene. So here we are. I do want some fairly accurate numbers or values for the transform of this box. And again, some of these values for the table, it's not as important, but others are more important. We'll let you know as we move along. But first, before we actually change the translation, let's go ahead and change the name of the box. So I don't want it to say box, I want it to say table. And so I'm going to select the top component when I have the box selected, and that'll open up the metadata information about it, and I will just call it table. And notice how it automatically updates over here in the entities panel. Good. All right, now let's change the scale of this. I want to do this I'll just go ahead, I want some exact numbers, so I'm going to go 4.5 scale on the x-axis. I want 0.1 on the y, because I want it fairly flat. And then 2. I want it 2 units wide or so. Okay, so that's my table. However, I do need to nest this table into another entity, because when I tilt this later on in the course, I want it to rotate not around this center axis. I want to have it rotate around this axis over here. Meaning I want the edge of my table to remain in the same spot and then just move up instead of having the edge of the table change throughout the course of the scene. Again, that'll make sense a little bit more when we get to that behavior, when we create that behavior to make that happen. But we want to set that up correctly from the get-go. So I'm going to go ahead and click Create Entity. And this is having to do with nesting and grouping. That's what we're doing right now. I'm going to click Create Empty Entity, where it just says entity. And instead of entity, I want to rename it. So I'm going to click that top component over here, and I'll call it table offset. Now it's also in the same, they currently have the same translation values, the table and the table offset, but we're going to change that. So I'm going to drag my table into my table offset over here in the entities panel. It'll disappear. That's because it's now nested inside the table offset. But what I want to do is I want to move the table offset. I want it to be different. I want to have some different translation values. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag it over this way, and I want it to be right about there. Because the center of our scene or the center of the table offset is about right here on my grid. So I'm going to move it to right there. Now when I select the table offset, there. That's where I want it to be rotating, and that's why I had to nest it. However, I do want to move this up a little bit to roughly, we'll just make it 1.3. All right, so it's flat now. Now I need to rotate it by just a little bit. And we'll change it, the Z rotation to be 2. So now we have the table hovering a little bit above our ground by 1.3. And just so you have a little bit of reference, these values represent close to a meter. And so that's about 1.3 meters high in the real world. All right, so we'll keep it right there. We will return to this table in a little bit, but that should do for the transform values. Okay, we do want to create another entity, and that we want to create a ground for our scene. So right now, again, if I turn off the grid, there's really nothing. It's just this table. But that doesn't work for us. We want to add, I'll turn the grid back on. We want to add some ground. So what I'm going to use is a disk. So under the create entity menu, I click that, and then I go to 3D primitives, and I find disk. Now we get a disk in the middle. One thing to note about a disk, and this is important, is that disks and also quads, both 3D primitives, one is a circle and one's a square essentially, so you can only see them on one side. So right now I can see it from this side, but if I rotate around, I can't see it anymore. That is useful for a very good reason. We'll learn that later in the course. And so that does happen on purpose, and we do want that to happen in this case. However, it's sitting straight up and down vertically. We want to change that, so I'm going to change this to -90. And then we are going to change the scale to, and if I click uniform scale, so this will change the values in all directions. We're going to change it to 100. So now I have a ground that goes a lot further out, just a big circle. Now you notice that both of these entities have this light white, almost white. It's kind of a light gray. Has to do with the material color. We're going to cover that in the next video. So I hope you join us. Thanks.